Resident Evil is one of the most recognizable franchises on the planet, spanning dozens of games, movies, comics, books, and toys. Released in 1996, the original Resident Evil had a massive impact on how the video game industry thought about horror games, and would go on to influence an entire generation of gamers and developers alike. What you may not know is that the development of Resident Evil houses more secrets than the Spencer Mansion. This is the secret origin of Resident Evil. Horror games had already been around for decades by the time Resident Evil made its debut. But to understand the origins of Resident Evil, you need to look no further than Capcom's seminal NES RPG Sweet Home. Released in 1989 only in Japan, Sweet Home was based on a Japanese horror film of the same name. The game was directed by Tokuro Fujiwara, who made a name for himself working on Capcom classics like Ghosts and Goblins and Bionic Commando. Sweet Home told the story of 5 documentary filmmakers who wind up trapped inside a haunted mansion in the middle of a spooky forest. The game featured obtuse puzzles, a limited inventory, an emphasis on survival, and a surprising amount of slowly opening doors. By 1993, Capcom had cornered the market on platformers, fighting games, and brawlers, and had established itself as one of the most important developers in gaming. It was around this time that Fujiwara suggested remaking Sweet Home for next-gen 32-bit consoles, stating his belief in horror games as a viable genre. He handed the reins to Shinji Mikami, a relatively young developer who had previously directed a number of successful and beloved Capcom Disney games, including Goof Troop and Aladdin, on the Super Nintendo. Mikami and his team began designing characters for Capcom's Sweet Home remake, writing early drafts of the script and handpicking elements from horror staples like Dawn of the Dead and The Shining. Resident Evil's initial prototype was a first-person adventure that featured a more supernatural feel, closer to the ghosts and monsters seen in Sweet Home. This version was eventually scrapped, as Mikami didn't feel the PlayStation's hardware was powerful enough to do the game justice at the time of development. Also left on the cutting room floor were characters Dewey, a goofy medic, and Gelzer, a hulking cyborg. They were replaced by Rebecca Chambers and Barry Burton, 2 characters who better fit into the more serious and somber tone Capcom had in mind for the project. Zombies soon became the game's primary enemy, and Mikami opted for a fixed cinematic camera and pre-rendered backdrops similar to the systems seen in Infogram's 1992 classic Alone in the Dark. As the game neared completion, Capcom coined the phrase survival horror, a term that would quickly grow into an entire genre. Resident Evil popularized pre-rendered backgrounds, claustrophobic environments, and limited movement and inventory. Many of these tropes would become genre staples and be used in other hit survival horror games like Clock Tower 2, Silent Hill, and Parasite Eve. Among the numerous legends surrounding the game's release, the most bizarre is how the series earned its Western title. It's widely known that in Japan the Resident Evil series is called Biohazard, but Capcom was reluctant to release the game abroad under that moniker. Chris Kramer, who was the director of communications for Capcom at the time of release, had remarked that Biohazard was nearly impossible to trademark. The name Resident Evil was a result of a company-wide contest and was a major point of contention. Naming controversy aside, Resident Evil was released on March 22, 1996, to resounding success. In a time before Crash Bandicoot and Tomb Raider, Resident Evil helped put Sony's fledgling PlayStation on the map. Resident Evil would go on to sell over 12 million copies, making it one of the most successful games of the era. As Resident Evil's popularity grew, Capcom began tinkering with their newfound hit, tweaking and re-releasing it over and over throughout the 90s and beyond.
We continued our search for the other members, and it turned into a nightmare.
First up was Director's Cut in 1997, which swapped item placement and enemies and showcased different costumes. Infamously, the US release of Director's Cut was supposed to feature an uncensored version of the game's gory opening cinematic, but it actually retained the original black and white intro due to a localization mistake. Also notable among these releases was the Sega Saturn version, which featured a battle game that would serve as inspiration for the popular survivor modes in later Resident Evils. This port also featured bonus enemies, including a Golden Tyrant and a zombie version of the series' antagonist, Albert Wesker. There was even an extremely impressive and faithful Game Boy Color port in the works from London-based HotGen Studios, but it was scrapped just before release. A Nintendo DS version, however, did make it to store shelves in early 2006. Ironically, the laughable voice work in the original version was the lesser of two evils.
Kenneth was killed too. Maybe by this creature.
Mikami's team filmed the FMV sequences and recorded English and Japanese dialogue in Japan, but the game only shipped with the English voiceover, as Mikami found the Japanese cast's work underwhelming. The Japanese development staff were unaware of how poorly the game was localized and often cite this criticism as one of the driving forces behind 2002's remake.
Stop it! Don't open that door!
Jill, no. You don't want to go back out there.
In 2008, the original was recognized by the Guinness Book of World Records for having the worst game dialogue.
That was too close. You were almost a Jill sandwich.
You're right. Barry, thanks for saving my life.
Resident Evil changed video game horror forever. It had a deep and lasting impact on other beloved horror franchises. And more than 20 years later, Capcom's original survival horror hit commands so much respect that its influence is still being felt. The original Resident Evil has spawned 24 games and 6 feature films. While the franchise has had its ups and downs, Capcom's willingness to rethink and reinvent what it means to be a survival horror game has kept Resident Evil consistently relevant for more than 2 decades.
What is this place?
Not quite your ordinary house, that's for sure.
If you enjoyed this video, make sure to share it with your friends and check out our other Secret Origin features on Dark Souls and Westworld. For more on Resident Evil, stick with your fellow Umbrella operatives at IGN.